Most of Washington was under the control not of the federal government, but of a left-wing politician like Marion Barry, who frequently takes the side of rioters against law enforcement. Would you trust Mayor Bowser to keep Washington safe if she were given the powers of a governor? Would you trust Marion Barry? More important, should we risk the safety of our capital on such a gamble? Now, of course, the Democrats will argue that the statehood bill doesn't entirely eliminate federal control of Washington because it preserves a small federal district that encompasses the White House, the Capitol, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, the National Mall, and a few other government buildings. What a humbling demotion from the grand federal city that President Washington and Pierre L'Enfant envisioned more than 200 years ago, which they hoped would rival Paris in size and ambition. By contrast, look at this ridiculous map. Look at it. The Democrats propose to turn Washington into little more than a gerrymandered government theme park, surrounded on all sides by a new state, controlled, of course, by the Democrats. The federal government's safety and independence cannot be assured by such a laughable district. Again, look at it. It's got 90 sides. A mere city block, less than 200 yards, separates the White House from the proposed boundaries of a new state, governed at present by a politician who hates the president. The Supreme Court and several congressional office buildings are right at the edge of the map, separated from the new Democratic state by the width of a single city street. In the event of an emergency like the Philadelphia Mutiny of 1783, those narrow boundaries could jeopardize the operations of the federal government. Consider also what's not included in this ridiculous new map of a new Washington, D.C. The headquarters of the Department of Homeland Security would be outside the federal government's control, as would be the headquarters of the FBI and the FCC, which governs all communications in the country. The seat of government would be separated for the first time from its military bases, Fort McNair in southwest Washington, the Marine Barracks in southeast Washington, and Bowling Air Force Base across the river. Washington's roughly 200 foreign embassies would no longer be in the federal district, but in the Democrats' new state, giving it unusual prominence in foreign affairs, precisely the kind of special treatment the founders hoped to avoid by creating a federal city. And while the proposed federal district would have access to a single power plant, undoubtedly it would rely on the Democrats' new state for many basic utilities, not just power, but water, sewage, and telecommunications. It would also rely on the new state, as well as Virginia, for access by land. The civil servants and officers of the federal government would have no choice but to reside in a different state on which they would wholly depend for access to the federal zone. Now, these may seem like minor or obscure problems, and in peaceful times maybe they are. But recognize the truth. The government of the most powerful nation in the world wouldn't have control of critical infrastructure necessary for its own safety, functioning, and independence in a crisis. Maybe that seems like a remote danger, although one should think better after the riots earlier this month. To say nothing of the Civil War itself, when our seat of government faced imminent danger of encirclement by hostile forces. In fact, the danger was so severe that President Lincoln wanted Washington to be enlarged, not diminished, to include the area south of the Potomac that was retroceded to Virginia in 1846. He said, "The present insurrection shows, I think, that the extension of this district across the Potomac at the time of establishing the capital here was eminently wise, and consequently, that the relinquishment of that portion of it which lies within the state of Virginia was unwise and dangerous." How much more unwise and dangerous would it be to shrink the federal district even further, to just a few buildings in a 90-sided map? But that's exactly what the Democrats propose to do. And those are just the practical and prudential problems. DC statehood also presents a grave constitutional conundrum. Attorneys General as diverse as Bobby Kennedy and Ed Meese understood that the 23rd Amendment to our Constitution forecloses the Democrats' statehood proposals. The 23rd Amendment, ratified in 1961, gave Washington residents a meaningful vote in presidential elections. The amendment grants 3 electoral votes to, in its own words, the district constituting the seat of government of the United States. But of course, the Democrats' new state would also be entitled to its own 3 electoral votes. Yet if the 23rd Amendment isn't repealed, the rump federal district will retain its 3 electoral votes. The practical effect, of course, would be to increase the swamp's electoral power in presidential elections. Even the radical Democrats can't ignore this thorny problem. Their bill calls for the swift repeal of the 23rd Amendment, but they would allow Washington to become a state before the amendment is repealed. But there's no assurance that the amendment would actually be repealed. The Constitution has only been amended on 18 occasions in our nation's history. It's not a walk in the park in the best of times, yet the Democrats want you to think that they can pull off an amendment to alter the Electoral College in the midst of a presidential election. And in the meantime, D.C. statehood, along with the 23rd Amendment, will lead to absurd consequences. This small federal district with 3 electoral votes would have virtually no residents. In fact, as far as I can tell, the only residence in the district is right here, the White House. So if the House passes its bill tomorrow and the Senate were to approve it for the president's signature, then Donald and Melania Trump need only change their voter registration from Florida to Washington to get their very own 3 electoral votes. I can't help but think this isn't what Nancy Pelosi had in mind. Even putting aside these practical and constitutional problems with D.C. statehood, though, we return to a basic truth. Washington is a city with all the characteristics of a city, not a state. Washington doesn't have the size or diversity of interest of even the smallest of the 50 states. Consider Washington's size. At just shy of 70 square miles, D.C. is 18 times smaller than the smallest state in the Union, Rhode Island. But of course, the Democrats say size doesn't matter. What matters is population. Washington has just over 700,000 residents, more than Wyoming and Vermont, and about as many as Alaska. Doesn't this qualify Washington as a state? Well, if it did, we'd need a lot more states because Washington is just the 20th largest city in the country. If Washington deserves to be a state at 700,000 residents, how much more does New York City deserve to be its own state at 8 million residents? Perhaps Bill de Blasio should trade out his title of mayor for governor, all the better to battle his nemesis, Andrew Cuomo, on equal terms. But let's not give the Democrats any bright ideas. What about Jacksonville, Florida, at more than 900,000 residents? Shouldn't we have a state of Jackson to accompany the new state of Washington? Well, we all know that won't do. Jacksonville is governed by a Republican, and the Democrats have canceled Andrew Jackson. Washington also doesn't have the diversity of interest and financial independence that Madison explained were necessary for a well-functioning state. Yes, Wyoming is smaller than Washington by population, but it has 3 times as many workers in mining, logging, and construction, and 10 times as many workers in manufacturing. In other words, Wyoming is a well-rounded, working-class state. A new state of Washington would not be. What about Alaska? It provides more than 60% of the nation's seafood, and its vital geography both protects the entire nation with missile defense systems and enables us to check Russian and Chinese ambitions in the Arctic. But what vital industries would the new state of Washington represent? Lobbying? Bureaucracy? Give me a break.